They say history isn't written in ink, it's written in blood, in sweat, and in the trembling hands that refuse to let go. But what happens when the hands holding history belong to a 19-year-old boy who's never seen the world beyond his hometown? What makes someone like that, someone with dreams, fears, and a mother waiting back home, grab a rope slick with rain and climb toward hell? That question still echoes across the cliffs of Normandy. The morning of June 6, 1944, didn't look like the beginning of history. It looked like fog and salt water. It sounded like the low hum of engines cutting through uncertainty. And in one of those landing crafts, Private First Class Howard Bowen, just 19, from New Jersey, stood shoulder to shoulder with men who looked calm but weren't. Because calm isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to keep climbing anyway. The air was cold. The kind of cold that seeps through your uniform and finds its way into your bones. Each wave slammed against the hull like a heartbeat growing louder. No one spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because every man already knew what the other was thinking. What if I don't make it? What if I freeze when it's time to move? What if this is it? But Howard wasn't thinking about death. He was thinking about the promise he made to his mother before he left home. He had told her, "I'll come back wearing this uniform with pride." She had smiled, touched the patch on his shoulder, and whispered, "Then wear it well, my boy. Because that patch means freedom." And in that moment, soaked in sea spray and fear, that memory became his anchor. When the first explosion hit, the world tilted. The landing craft beside them vanished in a burst of flame and steel. Men shouted. Water turned red. But the Rangers didn't stop. They didn't have that luxury. Colonel James Rudder, the man leading them, had already made a decision the night before, one that would define this mission. He had replaced an officer who doubted the plan. Because he knew something every soldier eventually learns: fear spreads faster than courage if left unchecked. And courage, like a rope, needs tension to hold. 40 minutes from shore, everything had gone wrong. The tide was against them. The cliffs loomed ahead like stone giants, slick with rain and shadow. 2 boats were gone. The rest had drifted off course. The Germans were awake, and the sky was already on fire. But Rudder didn't wait for perfect clarity. He gave the order anyway. Go. That's the thing about history, it doesn't wait for the brave to feel ready. It waits to see who climbs first. Howard's boat hit the shallows. Cold water swallowed his legs as he jumped out, rifle over his head. He could barely see through the smoke, but he could hear it, the hiss of ropes, the click of carabiners, the scrape of boots on stone. Men were climbing. Not charging, not shouting, climbing. And in that sound, something changed inside him. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about proving that fear doesn't own him. That his mother's words, "Wear it well, my boy," weren't just a farewell. They were a command. The ropes were slick, soaked in salt and blood. Above, machine guns tore the air apart. Every second felt like a lifetime. He saw men fall, ropes cut, hands slipping, grenades tumbling down like rain. Uncertainty. Doubt. Fear. They weren't just emotions anymore, they were living things, whispering in every ear, testing every grip. And yet, no one let go. Howard's hands burned. His muscles screamed. He could feel the weight of not just his own body, but the men beside him. Because that's what courage really is, supporting not just your weight, but theirs too. One man slips, and another steadies him. One loses hope, and another lends him strength. That's how they climbed. Inch by inch. Breath by breath. And somehow, that made the impossible feel possible. When he finally reached the top, the sky broke open. Smoke. Fire. Silence. He was standing in history, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. The mission was far from over. The guns still roared. But Howard looked back down that cliff, and saw the ropes swaying in the wind. Each one was a story. A memory. A man who refused to let go. He didn't know it then, but those ropes would become symbols. Not of war, but of will. The will to climb even when every voice inside you says stop. The will to move forward when everything around you is falling apart. The will to keep history alive, one grip at a time. Because courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the rope you grab when fear tries to pull you down. It's strange how a single voice can cut through chaos. One command, steady, unshaken, can drown out a storm of doubt. When Colonel James Rudder took the microphone that night before D-Day, his men didn't just hear orders. They heard conviction. They heard resolve strong enough to hold the weight of 225 Rangers and the fate of an entire operation. He wasn't the loudest man in the room, but his silence carried authority. When he relieved the officer who'd started to doubt, no one argued. Not because they were afraid, but because deep down, every man there needed that decision. Fear, left unchecked, multiplies. But courage, real courage, starts with one man refusing to let doubt take root. As Rudder stood before his Rangers, the smell of salt and diesel filled the air. They were just hours from boarding, but he didn't speak about glory or victory. He spoke about resolve. He told them that when their boots hit the sand, clarity wouldn't come. No perfect moment would appear to tell them when to move, when to climb, or when to lead. Gentlemen, he said, the sea won't wait, the cliffs won't wait, and neither will history. It wasn't a speech to inspire, it was a call to remember. Every man there had volunteered. Not one had been drafted. That choice, to step forward willingly into the impossible, meant something. And Rudder's eyes told them he hadn't forgotten. When the briefing ended, Howard stood outside the tent staring at the dark horizon. He could hear the hum of engines, the rustle of rope, the quiet clink of metal. He wasn't thinking about medals or missions. He was thinking about home, about the dinner table his mother would set for 3, even though only 2 sat there now. His father had passed before the war. Howard remembered his words the night before he shipped out. Son, courage isn't loud. It's just steady. It doesn't need to shout to be heard. Now, as the wind cut through the camp, those words felt heavier than ever. Tomorrow, he'd need that kind of courage, the kind that whispers keep climbing when the world screams turn back. At 0400 hours, the Rangers moved to their landing craft. Rain drizzled like cold needles against their faces. The ocean ahead looked endless, the cliffs invisible in the mist. Rudder moved among them quietly, nodding once at each group, a silent exchange that said everything. He wasn't above them. He was with them. Howard caught a glimpse of him stepping onto his own boat, the leader refusing the comfort of command from afar. That image stayed burned in his memory. Because Rudder didn't lead from the rear. He led from the front, where bullets find the brave first. The engines roared to life, and the boats pushed off. The shoreline faded, swallowed by fog. For 40 minutes, the sea tossed them like toys. Men gripped their rifles, knuckles white, eyes fixed on the horizon. Every minute stretched like an hour. And in that silence between the waves, doubt crept in again. Howard could hear it in the way the men beside him whispered a prayer. He could feel it in the tremor of his own hands. Uncertainty. Doubt. Fear. They were as real as the salt in the air. But he remembered Rudder's words, the sea won't wait. And he realized something, neither should he. So, when the cliffs came into view, he didn't hesitate. He didn't look for the perfect moment to feel brave. He just moved. The landing went wrong almost immediately. 2 crafts were lost before they ever touched the sand. The others were pushed off course by the current. Smoke blanketed the shore. Bullets stitched the water like rain. But Rudder's voice, calm, sharp, deliberate, broke through the chaos. Forward. Go. That was all it took. Howard jumped. The water swallowed him up to his chest. He could taste the metal in the air. Men shouted, stumbled, sank, but the line didn't break. They pushed forward, every step fueled not by the promise of success, but by the refusal to surrender. That's something only soldiers understand. Sometimes the most heroic act isn't charging ahead, it's simply refusing to stop moving. By the time they reached the base of the cliffs, everything they'd rehearsed was gone. The perfect plan had drowned somewhere in the tide. And yet, Rudder didn't wait. He pointed upward, toward a wall of stone, smoke, and fire, and said, climb. That word, simple, brutal, final, cut through everything. It wasn't an order anymore. It was a dare. Howard's heart pounded. He grabbed the rope, slick, cold, alive with the tremor of the men climbing ahead of him. Every muscle burned. Every instinct screamed stop. But the sound of men climbing beside him reminded him that courage doesn't live in silence. It lives in collective breath, in the sound of boots scraping stone, in the hiss of rope under tension, in the groan of men who climb because they believe something bigger waits above. For every foot he gained, another man fell. Ropes cut. Grenades rolled down. The air was filled with screams and prayers. But still they climbed. Inch by inch. Heartbeat by heartbeat. Until the impossible began to look inevitable. Because somewhere between the ocean and the sky, between death and history, Howard realized the truth. You don't conquer fear by fighting it. You conquer it by outlasting it. And that's exactly what they did. By the time Howard's boots touched the top, the beach below was chaos, but the cliffs were theirs. He looked back at the sea, smoke rising like ghosts from the water. Rudder stood just a few yards away, shouting new orders, his voice hoarse but steady. In that moment, Howard understood something his father had tried to teach him long ago: leadership isn't about being fearless. It's about holding the line long enough for others to find their courage, too. And that night, under the torn sky of Normandy, the Rangers didn't just claim victory. They defined what courage means for every generation that would come after. The sea was violent that morning, restless, gray, and cold. The kind of sea that doesn't forgive hesitation. The boats pitched and rolled as waves crashed against their sides, and the Rangers gripped their ropes tighter, eyes fixed on the towering cliffs that rose like giants out of the water. Somewhere up there, death waited, but so did history. Private Howard Bowens felt the spray sting his face. He was only 19, but the lines of exhaustion already marked his eyes. He'd been trained for this moment, yet nothing could truly prepare him for the sound of incoming fire slicing through the air. Around him, men prayed quietly, their voices drowned by the roar of the engines and the ocean's fury. Then the voice came, steady, unshaken, commanding. Rangers, lead the way. It wasn't just an order. It was a challenge to the soul. Howard looked up. The cliffs loomed impossibly high, sheer black rock scarred by explosions. Smoke drifted across their surface like a warning. Every instinct screamed to stay low, to turn back, but there was no turning back. Not now. As they neared the shore, the boats were thrown into chaos. 2 landing crafts were hit. Flames leapt into the sky. Screams cut through the mist. But even through the terror, the Rangers pressed forward. Their training took over where fear tried to take hold. Howard's landing craft hit the sand hard. The impact jolted his knees. "Move," someone shouted, and they leapt into the icy water, rifles raised. The sound was deafening, bullets striking the surf, shells exploding against the cliffs. Men fell. The rest kept running. Howard reached the base of the cliff, gasping. The rock was slick with seawater, ropes already being fired upward by grappling hooks. Some caught, others slid loose. The enemy fired down from above, cutting lines and men alike. It was chaos, a storm within a storm. He pressed his back against the rock, panting. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. His heart pounded so loud he could barely hear the gunfire. He looked up, trying to find courage somewhere in that impossible climb. Uncertainty. Doubt. Fear. Those were the words their commander had spoken days earlier. Let them exist, but never let them lead. Howard closed his eyes. The words replayed in his mind, steadying him. He grabbed the wet rope. It burned his palms instantly. And he started to climb. Every inch was a battle. Every movement demanded everything he had. The cliff face seemed endless, and the higher he went, the louder the war grew. Grenades rolled down. Men fell past him, silent. The rope swayed violently, but he held on. When doubt crept in, he forced it out with a single thought: if I fall, the men behind me falls too. So he climbed harder. For the men below. For the men beside him. For the mission. Halfway up, his arm gave out. He dangled there, feet scraping for grip. His vision blurred, breath shallow. The instinct to let go whispered seductively. But then, a sound broke through the noise. Someone above shouted his name. Howard. Keep moving. It wasn't just encouragement. It was a lifeline. He clenched his jaw, pulled, and pushed upward with everything left in him. Inch by inch. Breath by breath. The cliff tore his gloves. His hands bled. But his will hardened. And as he neared the top, a strange calm settled over him. He realized that courage wasn't loud. It was quiet, like the sound of rope tightening in your grip when every part of you wants to let go. By the time he reached the summit, his body was shaking, his uniform shredded, his hands raw. He didn't celebrate. He didn't even speak. He just knelt, chest heaving, staring at the field ahead, and the horizon beyond it. Because in that moment, he understood something only those who climb into fire ever learn. Victory isn't about who reaches the top. It's about who refuses to fall. And that was the moment Howard Bowens became more than a soldier. He became a ranger. When Howard's boots scraped over the final edge of the cliff, he didn't cheer. None of them did. There were no cries of victory, no music, no glory. Only the ragged sound of breathing, dozens of men gasping for air like survivors pulled from the depths of the sea. The ground beneath them was uneven, cratered, soaked in blood and seawater. The smell of smoke hung heavy, burning their lungs with each breath. Above them, the sky glowed a faint orange, fire mixed with dawn. And somewhere out there, beyond the haze, the enemy still waited, unseen but not far. Howard pressed his palms into the dirt and looked back at the cliff. The rope still hung there, swaying slightly, marked by the weight of men who would never finish the climb. He swallowed hard. The silence pressed in like a weight. Colonel Rudder crouched nearby, his face streaked with mud, eyes fixed on the horizon. He didn't need to speak, his presence alone steadied them. Every ranger could feel it, the calm of a man who understood that leadership isn't shouting orders. It's standing where the fear is loudest and not flinching. A soft whistle cut through the air. Form up. The men regrouped quickly, moving low through the tall grass, rifles ready. They'd made it up, yes, but that was only the beginning. Their mission wasn't to survive the climb. It was to silence the guns that could still destroy thousands more down on the beaches below. Howard crawled forward on his elbows, heart hammering. Every step felt like trespassing into death's backyard. The air carried the bitter tang of cordite. Somewhere ahead, a machine gun opened fire, not at them, but close enough to feel the vibration through the ground. He scanned the landscape. What had once been a peaceful stretch of coastline was now a graveyard, shattered bunkers, burning debris, twisted metal half buried in the soil. And still, the rangers advanced. Inch by inch. Breath by breath. Then came the moment that none of them would forget. A single flare burst overhead, bathing everything in ghostly white light. For 1 second, Howard saw it all, the faces of his brothers in arms, dirt-streaked and determined, the cliff behind them, dark and massive, and ahead, the bunkers where the enemy waited. Then, darkness again. He could feel the tremor in his own hands. He wasn't shaking from fear anymore, it was something deeper. Something like awe. He was alive. Against all odds, alive. But he also knew, many of the men he'd trained with were not. As they moved closer to the enemy positions, the terrain changed. The grass gave way to hardened earth, the remains of trenches and fortifications. Howard crouched behind a mound, scanning ahead. No movement, just the eerie stillness that always came before the next storm. The silence was thick enough to choke on. It wasn't peace. It was the sound of anticipation, the moment before the next heartbeat, before the next breath, before everything could explode again. Howard closed his eyes for a second and saw his mother's face. He heard his father's voice, the one that used to tell him, "Bowen's men don't back down." He smiled faintly. "Not today," he whispered. They moved again, silently, efficiently. Years of training had forged them into one living, breathing organism, a body of men bound by something stronger than blood, trust. Hours passed before they finally found them, the guns. Massive, black, and hidden deep within camouflaged positions further inland. They'd been moved since reconnaissance had last reported their location. The Rangers had climbed cliffs into hell itself to stop a threat that no longer stood there. But it didn't matter. Their mission had shifted. The guns had to be destroyed, wherever they were. They approached carefully, set their charges, and pulled back. Howard watched the fire bloom across the horizon, a slow, thunderous bloom that painted the morning sky. For a moment, no one spoke. It was done. But the victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt heavy. Real. Too real. Howard dropped to one knee beside a fallen comrade's helmet half buried in the mud. He lifted it gently, brushed off the dirt, and set it atop a nearby rock. It looked like a small monument in the middle of chaos. He didn't cry. He just sat there, breathing, remembering, absorbing the weight of what had just happened. When Colonel Rudder walked past, his voice was calm but softer now. "Hold the perimeter," he said. Howard looked up and saw it, the briefest crack in Rudder's command voice. The kind that reveals the men beneath the uniform. Even the strongest leaders, he realized, carry ghosts. As the sun broke fully over the horizon, Howard stood and looked out over the cliffs. The sea shimmered below, waves rolling against the rocks that had nearly claimed them. The sound of the wind filled the air again, softer now, almost peaceful. He thought of the men who didn't make it. The friends whose ropes were cut short. And he whispered their names to the wind. Because on that morning, victory didn't sound like celebration. It sounded like silence. And in that silence, he swore to remember. When the shooting stopped, the silence didn't bring peace. It brought memory. Howard sat beside the smoking remains of a bunker, the fire crackling softly, its warmth meaningless against the cold growing inside him. Around him, men moved like ghosts, carrying stretchers, digging shallow graves, whispering names under their breath. War had a strange way of teaching lessons no school ever could. It stripped away all illusions, about heroism, about glory, about what it means to be brave. Courage, Howard realized, wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to move anyway, even when your hands trembled, even when every instinct screamed, hide. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper, folded and faded from the climb. It was the letter from his younger brother, written just before he shipped out. "Bring yourself home, Howard. Mom can't lose both of us." He read it again, slower this time, the words cutting deeper than the first time. That letter was more than paper, it was a promise. And every promise had a price. As dusk fell, he walked through the camp, past medics tending to the wounded, past comrades sitting in silence, each one staring into their own private battlefield. He wondered what they were thinking, if they, too, felt that something inside them had been permanently changed. He stopped beside Private Langley, the youngest in their unit, barely 20. Langley had a shrapnel wound wrapped in rough bandages, his face pale. But his eyes were alive, wide, unblinking, still burning with something unbroken. "You did good today, kid," Howard said quietly. Langley smiled weakly. "Did we win?" Howard hesitated. The question hung in the air like smoke. "Yeah," he whispered finally. "We did." But deep down, he knew, victory and loss were the same face out here. That night, as he lay on the cold ground, Howard couldn't sleep. The stars were too bright, almost cruel in their beauty. They reminded him of home, of nights fishing with his father, of laughter echoing across the porch. He wondered if those stars looked different now, tainted by everything they'd seen. He turned on his side and stared at the horizon, where the faint glow of distant fires still flickered. Each one marked a life, a story, a memory. And he realized something no one had ever said out loud: in war, courage isn't just about facing death. It's about living with the memories afterward. Because the hardest part wasn't the battle. It was what came after, when the guns went quiet and your heart didn't. Howard found the box weeks later, while helping clear what was left of the enemy command post. It was buried beneath debris, metal, dust, the remnants of shattered lives. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. They were written by men on the other side, the enemy. But as he opened one and began to read, the words didn't sound like the enemy's. They sounded like his own. "Tell my mother I fought bravely. Tell her I thought of home before the end." Howard folded the letter carefully and looked around. The world was quiet again, but he could feel something shifting inside him. The realization that the men they fought weren't monsters, just sons, husbands, brothers, fighting under a different flag. That night, he wrote his own letter. Not to anyone in particular, just a letter to everything he'd lost. "If you ever find this," he wrote, "know that we weren't just fighting to live, we were fighting to remember who we were before the war took it from us." He never mailed it. He folded it neatly and tucked it into the pocket with his brother's letter. Some words weren't meant to be sent. They were meant to be carried. When the war finally ended, Howard expected joy. Instead, he felt emptiness. The ship that carried him home was silent. Men stood at the rails staring at the endless sea, each one lost in thoughts too heavy for words. As the coastline came into view, Howard's heart raced. Home. The word felt foreign now. What would he say to his mother? How do you explain the kind of silence war plants in your soul? When he finally stepped off the train, she was there, smaller, older, eyes red but shining. She didn't speak. Neither did he. They just held each other, and for the first time in years, he let the tears fall. That night, he sat on the porch, staring into the dark. The cicadas hummed softly, a sound he'd missed more than he realized. But even here, the war followed him, in echoes, in dreams, in sudden moments of stillness that felt too much like waiting. He reached for the folded letters in his pocket, one from his brother, one he'd written to no one. They were worn, edges soft from time. He placed them on the table beside him, beneath the old lamp, and whispered, "I'm home." The words didn't feel real yet. But they would, someday. Peace can be louder than war. Howard learned that in the years after he came home. The sounds of gunfire were gone, but the memories echoed in new ways, in sudden heartbeats, in the smell of smoke from a neighbor's chimney, in the clatter of thunder that made his pulse race. He worked at the docks, kept his head down, and tried to live like he used to. But normal wasn't something you could just go back to. One day, a child at the harbor dropped a toy gun, and the sound of it hitting the ground froze him completely. For a moment, he was back there, cliffs, chaos, fire. His breathing quickened. He realized then, not every scar bleeds. Some whisper. Some live quietly under the skin. That night, he wrote again. Not about the war, but about healing. About finding meaning in the broken pieces. If courage was what got us through the fight, he wrote, then forgiveness is what gets us through the silence that follows. He didn't know who would read it. But maybe, one day, someone would need those words as much as he did. Years passed. The world moved on. But Howard never forgot the cliff, or the men, or the silence that followed. Every year, on June 6th, he returned to that same piece of ground, Point du Hoc. The sea still roared below, and the wind still carried whispers of that morning. He'd kneel, lay down a single white flower, and close his eyes. In the distance, he could still hear them, laughter, shouts, the sound of boots on rock. He spoke softly to the wind, "You're not forgotten." And maybe that was the point all along, not to erase the pain, but to remember why it existed. Because remembrance is its own kind of victory. When Howard's time finally came, his family found a small box beside his bed. Inside were 2 letters, the same ones he'd carried all his life, and one more, freshly written. To whoever finds this, it read. Don't let the world forget the price of peace. Courage isn't born on battlefields, it's born in the hearts that keep living after. Beneath the letter was a photograph, the Rangers at the summit, smiling despite everything. And when they buried him, they read his words aloud under the open sky. The wind picked them up, carried them toward the cliffs, and for a brief moment, it felt as if the sea itself was listening. Because heroes aren't the ones who never fall. They're the ones who rise, remember, and keep walking, even when no one is watching.